Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Olivier Menel. I am the Events Officer at Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this new webinar about Microsoft Azure, which will be presented by Matt Walton and Joey Lau from InfoExchange. Before we start, just a quick reminder that this session is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to you shortly. You'll then be able to access that recording and the slides at any time on our website. If you have any question during the webinar, please type it in the question box on your webinar panel and we'll go through them during the session. If you have any technical issue, please also type it in the question box and I'll try my best to sort that out for you. And that's all from me. Matt, it's all yours.
Thanks, Ollie, and welcome everyone. Thanks for dialing in today to hear a little bit about Microsoft Azure. So as Ollie said, this is the first time we've done this. So we're today going to focus on a bit of the balance of more the high-level overview of what Azure is and some of the things it could do and why you would move down that direction. But we've also got a treat today. We've got Joey, who's one of our senior engineers here at InfoExchange, and he's going to talk through a case study of how we've implemented Microsoft Azure for one of our clients. So one example, which we think is a common one and a good one in the not-for-profit sector, that we're going to share with you so that it could give you an idea of how this could work for you. And he'll also give you some tips about actually how to go about setting up Azure and the key steps of what you need to do to get it and to get that $5,000 credit, which I'm sure you're all aware of. So moving right along, the key thing that how we've learnt about Microsoft Azure, it is a reasonably new product. It's only been out a few years from Microsoft. But we work with all sorts of not-for-profits. So we've got a range of not-for-profits that we work with, ranging from 2 staff and very volunteer-led organisations to large national organisations with thousands of staff. So we do work with all sorts of organisations, and that's why we've got a bit of an understanding of what works and what doesn't work and what's affordable and what's not affordable for a lot of typical not-for-profits. So we tend to try and design solutions that really are cost-effective, but also allow not-for-profits who often can't afford high-end technology, give them access to these new great platforms that all sorts of organisations, whether it's NAB or BHP, access these sort of high-end Microsoft products. So we're going to try and impart some of that experience on you today. So I suppose that the best place to start with these sort of decisions about moving to Azure or what technology you need is what is the problem, what is the challenge, and typically when we're out working with not-for-profits, what we see is that people are just looking for better ways for staff and volunteers to work out of the office and access systems and information. I'm sure we've all been part of one of those environments where there's a server in the office and we've all stored our documents or applications on a server, but wanted to access it from home or from a client site. So that's one of the most common requests that we get from not-for-profits, saying, look, I just want a solution to be able to access that information remotely. The other thing that a lot of organisations are starting to try and concentrate on is just that risk management and just making sure you've got a cost-effective online system and backups. So often to get the high-end systems, it can be very expensive. So just making sure you've got that backup and that redundancy and your risk management. Whereas a lot of people are heavily reliant on either one person or one server in their organisation. The other thing that's changing over the last few years in in not-for-profits is that consistent funding for IT. So no longer do we get the big grants. It's very rare now that you get the ability to go to a board or go to a funding body and say, hey, I want to go and spend $10,000, $20,000 on a server and a new system. Whereas what we're finding is the new cloud-based model where you just pay a monthly fee is actually a lot easier to incorporate it into your just operating expenses, as opposed to going to the board every few years to ask for a big capital injection and upgrade. The other main challenge that we find is people are, and not-for-profits, are really struggling to find good IT people, both resources and knowledge in the sector, because often not-for-profits can't afford to employ a team of IT people, at sometimes not even one. So you tend to be reliant on whether it's a local support provider or an IT manager. So that can create an issue, because often one person, whether they're just an IT manager in a small not-for-profit, often they can't keep up to date with everything, or they don't have access to the skills across all the different applications, whether it be skills in email, whether it be skills in servers, whether it be skills in websites. So what these cloud platforms are doing is they're just making it easier. So you don't need a server guy, you don't need an email technician, and you can just access all of that remotely. So really the key to what everyone is trying to achieve is that IT should just be a tool, an enabler to help you achieve your mission. So it shouldn't be something that you spend a lot of time or effort or expense on. It should just be something that allows you to do what you want to do as an organization and serve your clients, and do the work that you've been designed to do. So part of that is flexibility. So we often see organizations wanting to do all sorts of great things, have great ideas for how they can service their clients, but then often IT is the barrier. They go to do it, and then they realize that their service at capacity, or it's going to be too expensive to do what they need to do. So often IT currently, with a lot of our clients or previous clients, has been a barrier. So what Azure and other platforms are trying to do is just give you the flexibility to scale up and down and do what you need to do whenever you want to do it, and whenever, and let the business drive the IT and not the other way around. The other thing is just really optimizing those business processes and creating efficiencies. We're seeing all the time when we're going out to clients and they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on staff wages and on poor processes, and just doing manual handling and doing double steps and driving timesheets around the state, and doing manual payroll processes and those sort of things. So it's just putting in technology to allow you to be able to reduce some of that double handling and allow your staff to do the work they've been employed to do, which is help your clients typically. The third one, and a very important one, which people have more and more starting to realize, is business continuity and security. So things like the crypto locker virus, or a range of new issues out there, privacy laws about leaking client data, and those sort of things are getting clients to organizations to think more and more about their security of their data, and also business continuity. So if your server in your office goes down for a week, what real impact does that have on your organization? So these are the three key areas that we're seeing organizations needing a lot of help with, and that IT should be able to provide for you. So the cloud is allowing us to do this with a range of different ways. So these are some key areas that we've worked with organizations to be able to help them justify the move to a cloud or platforms like Azure. And often it's actually cheaper on Azure than it is on your current environment, or sometimes it just gives you that scalability and flexibility. So we've had examples where organizations have merged with other organizations and doubled in size overnight. And in that scenario, being on a platform like Azure means you can just basically scale up and add more servers or add more licenses. Whereas in the old environment, you would have had to gone out and basically paid $20,000 to buy a server, buy the software, buy the licenses, do the installation. So that's really the, one of the key benefits of cloud platforms. Defending against hardware failure. So again, no longer do you have to worry about the server in your office just, failing overnight and having to fix that when you get back in the morning, or come up with some other way to access your data, or put it all on a memory stick, or have some other solution. We just outsource that to someone like Microsoft now, and they look after it all for us. The other thing that's becoming more important is just having that one location for information. I think I'm sure you've all been in those scenarios where different, you're storing different copies of the same document all over the place. You've got one on your hard drive, you've got one on a USB stick, one on the server, and you're really struggling to find which one's the latest version. So having things centrally in the cloud that all staff access just really provides that reliability and quality of information, because you know that that's the right information. And obviously staff now are traveling, they're working from home, visiting clients, want to work off their smartphones and their laptops. So having all of the systems and information accessible is really important nowadays. So these are some of the things that you can use when you're going to your boards to say, hey, we want to move to Azure. Some of these things are the ways that you can justify the move, as opposed to buying a new server. So before we delve into the details of Microsoft Azure, I just wanted to make sure you're all thinking about your requirements. So the first real thing that you need to think about before you develop a technology solution is really, what are the things that you need? And every organization is different. So on this page, I just put a few examples of technology requirements. Now, some of these will be solved by the cloud, some of these will be solved by Azure, some of these will be solved by other applications or servers. But before you sort of go off and buy new products or move things to Azure, you first need to understand, what do you need as an organization? So here's some good examples for that. All right, so really there's two key models of infrastructure. So we're headed a bit closer down the path of what is Microsoft Azure and what happens when we outsource. But a lot of you now would be in this scenario when you're owning the technology, when you're buying servers and you're upgrading servers. So there's some ongoing regular maintenance. You need to upgrade every couple of years when you're moving from Windows Server, 2008 to 2012. You generally need some in-house expertise to be able to manage that and to be able to run those upgrades, or if you don't have it in-house, you've got to pay someone to do that. Often there's limited scalability, so you've essentially got a finite amount of storage in that server, and then you just essentially, you would need to buy a new one or buy new disks or repurpose that if you actually have to add 10 more users or another application. So that's a key thing to think about. Disaster recovery, often there wasn't good disaster recovery solutions with all of those having servers in your office. And the uptime requirements. I know when I used to manage the server network, we essentially had to take it down every weekend to do updates and patches and maintenance and all of those things. So that meant that during that time, at Friday at 5 o'clock or whenever you did these, it means that your users can't access their systems. So that's in the old way where you used to own your own servers. But now it's headed to a more outsource model, essentially, where we let people like Microsoft look after it all for us and make sure there's a good level of reliability. So, you know, Microsoft have SLAs now where it's things like 99.9% uptime, where they guarantee that it's going to be reliable. They do all the backups for you. They're the ones doing all the security compliance and getting all their certifications and meeting all the standards of storing data. But one of the best bits is it's always up to date. So you don't need to do upgrades every 2 or 3 years. It's always just on the latest version of Server or SQL or whatever it is. And it's really top quality servers. So essentially this is the same infrastructure that, again, large corporates and governments are using. So it no longer are NFPs treated like a second-class citizen where we have to use hand-me-downs. This is, top of the range. And it's expandable. So really, you only use what you need and you only pay for what you need. So really, in summary, the key differences between the two models are platforms like Azure. There's ongoing costs. You are relying on the internet, so it's very web-based. It's hosted externally by someone else. The updates are automated. The costs are combined with software and hardware, so it's just one fee. And you need to consider, what happens if you're offline. Whereas in the old model, the server model, you basically buy the servers up front. You're relying on your local network and being accessible to that location. So everything's stored locally. And you've got that ongoing maintenance required. So you have to purchase the software and the hardware. And then obviously then you've got to think about offsite backups. All right, so I think that's enough for cloud versus local infrastructure. So I hope that's given you some background information on why you would consider Microsoft Azure versus your local servers. And don't get me wrong, there are places for both. There's no right or wrong answer here. So the next slide, now I'm going to go into, what is Microsoft Azure? So essentially this is Microsoft's marketing terms for what is Azure. So essentially it's a platform, allows you to develop your own computing tasks in the cloud at any scale and on demand using pay-as-you-go. So that's a good sort of summary of what that is. So I hope that makes sense. So they've given some examples there around web applications, backup, disaster recovery, and virtual machines. But it essentially means you don't have to invest in hardware and staff anymore. You can use, these and access this technology. So that's what Microsoft have said. Now this is, again, just trying to make it a bit more practical. And so this is my definition of Azure, where really it's a paid service for IT infrastructure or server hosting that some of you may use instead of having a server on premises. So in reality, it's actually just Microsoft hosting some servers in data centers. So there's one in Sydney, one in Melbourne, and they're selling it to you on a monthly fee. What it does do, what I like about it, it allows you to pick and choose what you need. So you essentially go and select from a menu, which Joey will demonstrate later, and it allows you to just pay for what you need. So there isn't one set model. So, we do webinars with Office 365 where we say this is a license you should have and it's $6.38 a user a month. Azure's not like that with a fixed product. It's essentially you build your own product based on what you need, and you access it over the internet. So you do need a good quality network. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. So what can you do with Azure? Again, this is what Microsoft is saying, all these things, and to be honest, you probably won't know what all of those things mean, and that's okay. Really, it's a really flexible tool and a very broad tool that will be used differently for a lot of people, and it will also be it will grow and change, and you will grow and change. So you may use it for some things in the next year or two, but maybe in a couple of years you'll start getting a bit more sophisticated with your use of technology and start using it for sort of data analytics and machine learning and or mobile apps and those sort of things. So that's really a whole big broad range, and to be honest, it can get confusing because there's such a broad range of things that it can do. So what we're trying to do is help you understand initially what we're seeing as the key things that not-for-profits in Australia may use it for. And we've come up with this list of 5 key things that in practical terms we can imagine. In some case we've developed these for not-for-profits in Australia and are using it right now successfully. So these are practical things that you can do right now with Microsoft Azure. So one of the key things that, again, we'll use a case study next, where Joey will talk you through a server hosting. So essentially, instead of having a server in your office, you're putting a server up into Microsoft Azure, and that's like a domain controller or file archives as examples, and accessing it there instead of accessing it from your office. So that's probably the easiest and most practical way for organizations to use Azure. The second one is backup storage. So we've got some of our clients using backup. So instead of doing the old tape backup where you have to, plug a tape into the server every morning and take it home or put it in a desk or get it picked up by someone, essentially what this is doing, it's transferring data from your local storage up into Microsoft Azure and storing it there. Now the extension of that some of our clients are doing is actually, if your local site goes down, then you can expand all that storage, you can expand what you do in Azure and actually use it as a business continuity site or disaster recovery and actually access all your systems and your files from Azure. So that's going to become more and more important with people wanting access to these sort of things, and as part of their risk management and business continuity plans, having that option and having an easy, scalable solution that essentially you don't pay for 300 days of the year, and then you just increase it on the couple of days where you do need it. The other 2 down there are website hosting and application hosting. So they're potentially things that many organizations are doing. Instead of, again, hosting the applications on servers in your office or paying another external host to do that. So so there are 5 examples, but what I thought would be more helpful is for Joey, who's one of our engineers, to actually talk you through a case study. So of an organisation that we've done a migration for. So essentially, they're a large national not-for-profit organisation, 100 staff, and importantly, they didn't have just one main office. They had offices with staff in Melbourne and Sydney, and also small offices in Brisbane, Perth, and a few people who were just out and about all the time. So because of that, mainly because of that, they had a strong preference not to have any server infrastructure. And they really were focusing on using cloud-based applications, and all their staffs had laptops and smartphones. So mostly these guys actually use systems like Office 365 for email and SharePoint and Skype for Business, Salesforce for CRM. But in addition to that, they found they also needed some central management of their PCs, things like group policy, things like Active Directory to have the one username and password for all their staff, things like managing print and allowing people to, take their laptop from Sydney one day, they fly down to Melbourne the next day, they can actually easily print on the network on their same device. They also used it for storage of archives and backups. So they were the key things that they were needing, and based on that, this is where we we recommended that Microsoft Azure was suitable to meet those requirements. So I'll let Joey talk you through what we did with them.
Cool. Thank you very much, Matt. So what we ended up working with this client was to take a design for and link their sites with true virtual machines in the Microsoft Azure Sydney data center. Now they chose Sydney because that was the location of their head office. They could just as easily have chosen Melbourne. And in order to facilitate this, they were, at the same time as signing up with Microsoft Azure, they upgraded their routers and their internet connection to simulate as much as possible having the local LAN. And as Matt already mentioned, connectivity is really critical to having this Azure thing work. So in the scenario in this screenshot above, you'll see that the Sydney and Melbourne offices are identical. They each have PCs and laptops and at least one network printer. They each have a router that is on the Azure supported list, and there's actually a link site-to-site VPN between the two sites so that the two computers can communicate to each other. What they chose to then do is to deploy a traditional Active Directory domain controller as a virtual machine in Microsoft Azure's Sydney data center, as well as a file and print server that was a second virtual machine that had 600 gigs of storage in the cloud to allow them to store their archives. In addition to this, they separately engaged Office 365 to do email and document storage through their Exchange Online and SharePoint Online products, which is where the diagram shows that they're actually hosting to the public internet. So we were able to get quite smart with the way that the routers moved traffic. That's anything that was bound for authentication went directly to Azure, and anything bound for Exchange Online or SharePoint went direct out to Office 365. So it was just a very efficient way of moving things across. What you see there is that their internet connection at each site is 100 megabits per second or better. So the idea is they were able to simulate an on-premises switching environment, and it became really critical with some of the time critical in the large files they were moving across. So it is not expected that everybody will be able to get to that level of internet speed, but the general principle would be the faster the better, up to the point where your budget can afford. Now, next slide, please, Matt. And that was the design. Because they were an eligible non-profit, Office 365 was able to be implemented to them at no cost, so they were able to get their Exchange and SharePoint licenses at no cost. However, the Azure servers did actually cost them some money per month. So what we've ended up choosing for them is what they call A2 sized servers. So that's standard 2 CPU, 4 gig RAM, 135 gig hard drive servers. And they needed a pair of those, one as a domain controller and one as a file archive and print, and also running what's called AAD Connect, so that they could use the same password for their computers as they did for Office 365. Similar to join them all together, there was a requirement for a VPN gateway in Azure, which had that standard tier cost, and we factored 100 gigabytes of traffic per month traveling across. And as mentioned, they needed 600 gigs of basic tier storage to go and store their archive documents, and also ongoing support from the Microsoft team, so that if anything did ever go wrong in Azure, that we were able to call somebody 24/7, and then they would, within 8 hours, have a look. Now, you can see the figures on the screen there. It worked out to be approximately $717 a month at an annual total of about $8,600. Once you apply the non-profit credit, the annual cost ended up being about $3,600 for 2 cloud servers and all of the connectivity associated with that. So I don't know of anybody who can purchase a server at that speed for that for $3,600 a year. So it has ended up being a very good good deal for them. The link at the bottom there for those people who are interested in the pricing is actually an online pricing calculator. So if you feel that you might need other servers or other sizing, you're welcome to go in and get your own quotes for and summary estimates. Excellent. All right, next slide, please. So just quickly, I went through and attempted to take a few screenshots of what the setup involved. And as Matt mentioned, Microsoft Azure have data centers in Sydney and Melbourne, known as Australia East and Australia Southeast regions. But as you can see, they are a truly global hosting organization. So that map there shows every data center as of February 2017. And our focus largely are the 2 in Australia, but also it is not uncommon for some organizations who are multi-state to wish to look at the Southeast Asia or Japan data center regions as well for a little bit of geo-redundancy. Now, the reason I put this slide in is that you do need to select your region before you deploy resources into Microsoft Azure, because each region requires the following to support infrastructure. You would need to create what's called a resource group within each region, your virtual networks and local subnets, so that's your traditional switching for those who are more familiar with on-premises servers, your VPN gateways, your storage and your compute, so your virtual machines, all need to be specified in a specific region. And you can see on the right-hand side of that slide that when you create a storage account, one of the key questions they ask is what region, so what location you wish to choose. With storage in particular, you can choose what's called geo-redundancy, so that if you choose, say, Australia Southeast, which is Melbourne, and you wish to have a copy stored in Sydney and replicating in real time, you can choose that as well. But for everything else, you need to first pick a region and move from there. So for some advanced customers who would like to host in multiple regions, so if you would like Sydney and Melbourne, that's okay. It just means that you need to choose 2 regions, 2 gateways, and effectively your 2 Azure data centers become just like 2 Sydney and Melbourne offices. So that's the first slide, and that was just to create a storage account. Yep, moving on. You may have seen that I was referring to A2 sized machines. Now, there are specific sizing or pre-built server sizes that Microsoft Azure offer you as part of the service, and so it's not like your traditional other vendors, cloud vendors might have a little slide bar where you can say, yes, I want this many CPU cores and this much RAM and this much memory, and it calculates you a price. It is very much a pre-packaged options based on your needs. To help with that, though, there are many different sizes available to you. So when you do go and choose your compute size, you'll see that there are sort of over 20 different size options, and with monthly estimate costs according to each. So you can choose to either have your budget drive your resource usage, or have your resource usage then provide you with budgets if you need to go to the board. Now, the beauty of Microsoft Azure is that usage is actually billed by the hour. So every cost where there's a monthly cost is actually purely an estimate based on 744 hours in a month. So you'll find that, say, it gives you the flexibility of, if you find that your server was overspec'd and you wanted to wind down the amount of resources to save some money, you can actually do that in the Azure portal with a reboot required on your server. And likewise, if you want to scale up, you can do the same thing. There are lots of other options available as well, which include things like static IP addresses for if you're, say, hosting an FTP service or a web server and you need a specific IP address, you can set that in Azure. Also a static, what's called a virtual network. So any of the technical people out there will know, 10.10.10.0. If you do need to provide one of those in Microsoft Azure so that you can connect your sites together. So all of that can be set for, you can set yourself. You can also set static IP addresses for your servers, which is required for things like domain controllers who don't deal well with changing of IP addresses. The other options that you can see there are what's called the Network Security Group Firewall. So the beauty of Microsoft Azure is that all of their servers actually sit behind a separate firewall in addition to the Windows Server firewall that's installed on all Windows Server 2008 and 2012 and 2016 servers. And so this is the point where you can choose to open up specific ports. So if you needed an FTP server to store your remote backups, you can open that port, and you can also set what's called ACLs, or access control lists, to say, look, I only want my office to be able to upload data and access my Azure servers. I can actually lock that down to my specific IP address or IP address range. And so the other great thing about the security is that by default every port is shut except for the remote desktop port to allow you to actually access the server. So it has been built from the ground up with security in mind. The other thing I just quickly wanted to mention was that you see high availability and availability sets. So in order to claim on Microsoft's 99.9% uptime, they actually require you to deploy in what's called an availability set. In layman's terms, it is simply a second server that you have marked to Microsoft as a part of an availability set with another server. What that means from Microsoft's perspective is that they will store the server physically in a different location within the same data center. So, for example, the Melbourne data center has 2 floors. If you chose a set, they would choose one on one floor and one on a second floor, and they would also make sure that if they are doing back-end maintenance, that they don't bring down both supporting fabrics and supporting infrastructures at the same time. So that allows you to effectively roll out servers, pairs of servers, 3 or 4 servers, and scale them and ensure that you have very, very high availability within the same geographical location. And yeah, that's some of the other options available to you. We'll take it back to Matt. Oh no, that's my one. Okay, so I'm sure the burning question for people is, okay, great, how do I sign up? If you are an eligible non-profit and you have access to your TechSoup token, the sign-up process is slightly different to the standard Azure sign-up. What you would first do is, if you're, say, using Office 365, so if you have if you've chosen to take advantage of the non-profit plans, donated E1 licenses, what we recommend you first do is activate your Azure AD subscription from your Office 365 Admin Center. Now, why we say that is it then allows you to deploy your Azure grant, so your $5,000 credit, into the same Azure tenant account as your Azure AD subscription. And that can help with single sign-on later down the track, where, say, you wish to roll out individual services like SQL servers or hosted applications in Azure. You can then choose to say to people, okay, well, you can use your Office 365 email address and password to access services that are actually hosted wholly in Azure. So once you've activated your Azure AD subscription through the Office 365 Admin Center, you could then log into the Connecting Up portal and obtain the TechSoup validation token. Once you've gained that token, and I believe it's like a 32-character random string of text, you then visit the eligibility portal, which Matt has linked there, and enter your token. Once you enter your token, you will be asked to enter an account, a live ID, so the old Windows Live ID, as an account, which is where the activation links are actually sent to. Our recommendation, again, is that now that you've activated your Azure AD subscription, is that you use your Office 365 tenant admin email address as that live ID, rather than simply creating a private one. Within 24 hours, an email is then sent to that Office 365 admin account through Outlook, which contains a link to take you to the actual Azure sign-up page. Now, it is very, very important that you are signed in as your Office 365 administrator or your Azure AD administrator before you click that link, because otherwise it will prompt you to go ahead and create a brand new account and you lose that single sign-on capacity. And it's particularly important that you are signed in, because you only get one opportunity to activate your $5,000 Azure grant. So you do want to get this right once. And so, yeah, very important that you are signed in. Once you sign in and go through and accept the conditions, read the terms and conditions, you will also be prompted to enter a credit card. Now, the credit card is only required if your Azure account exceeds $5,000 in the 12-month period. Then the billing will automatically switch to pay-as-you-go and will bill your credit card. So it is not one of those schemes where they'll bill your credit card sneakily, even though you've got credits. Your credits will be used first, and then your credit card will be billed if you exceed that. And once you've completed the sign-up process, then you can log into the Azure portal, so portal.azure.com, sign in with your Office 365 admin credentials, and away you go. You would have access to create resources, groups, and all the goodies within Microsoft Azure.
Okay, thanks, Joey. I think it's good to get that bit of insight of someone who does this on a daily basis in terms of setting these up. There's all those little tricks in there that are helpful, you know, to know, because we often get not-for-profits come to us after they've gone through and they've done the wrong step, and it's a lot easier to get it right in the first stage or ask for help. So hopefully this has been a little bit helpful and given you some tips for those who are ready to go. But for those who are still a little bit confused, I think particularly those sort of non-technical personnel, I think there is still a lot of confusion out there around, you know, when you're designing your technology solutions, what you need Azure for and what you don't need Azure for. So what this next slide is trying to help you with is to try and understand in what scenarios you might need Azure, and what scenarios you would store things locally, and what scenarios you would just use someone else's services. So what we're saying is a lot of these systems traditionally you may have stored on a server. So 5 years ago, or you know, many of you will still be doing it now, you would have had an Exchange server where you've stored email on your server. You would have had a file server in your office, you would have had MyOb or something installed on your server, you may have been hosting websites, you may have had a client management database all sitting on your server. But nowadays, there's all these great systems that are out there that are online. So things like Office 365 or Gmail are out there on the cloud, delivered directly from Microsoft or Google, directly to you over an internet connection. So for this case, if you've got Office 365 for email, or you're looking at headed that way, you don't need Azure for email. So again, you can write that off as something that you don't need to worry about trying to put an Exchange box in Microsoft Azure or anything like that. Documents. Now there are online document platforms, so OneDrive and SharePoint are part of Office 365, and many of our clients use them for documents. There's also other products like Dropbox. Look, to be honest, you can have a file server on Azure. It's not always a great solution, depending on your internet connection. But so many people, you know, don't need Azure for documents either. Many people just use a local NAS storage, network attached storage, just a cheap mini server almost. Finance systems. So most people aren't hosting finance systems anymore. There's products like Xero or MyOb Online or Reckon that are all online hosted finance systems that, again, you don't need Azure for. If you've got something that you must have installed on a server, then yeah, you can explore whether that's suitable for Azure. But in most cases, it's not necessary. Websites. So again, we said that Azure does web hosting, and it does, but in many cases, most of our clients actually just use the things like Squarespace or WordPress, where you just buy an online website and they host it for you and they look after it. So again, you don't need Azure for a Squarespace site, for example. But if you had a real custom site that you needed your own server to have lots of add-ins and custom development, then yeah, maybe Azure is suitable for that. Same with client management systems. So a lot of them nowadays, supportability is one in the disability sector. SRS is a case management system that a lot of not-for-profits use as well. Both of those are hosted by those companies who host those. So you don't need to worry about hosting those in Azure. Whereas there's other products, CareLink Plus is one that I know of in the disability sector, and others that do have to be stored on a server. So in that case, if you want to move your server out of your office or wherever it is, then you may want to explore putting that in Azure. Same with CRM, Salesforce, Dynamics Online. There's a whole heap of online sugars and other ones, CRMs, all cloud-based. You don't need to worry about hosting. But again, there are some CRMs or access databases or things like that if they have to be on a server, then again, you might explore Azure. E-newsletters, MailChimps, social medias, Facebooks and Instagram. Obviously, you don't need Azure for any of those things. So that's really sort of writing off a lot of the things that you don't need Azure for. So I think as we touched on earlier, it's all about gathering your requirements and then working out what platform is most suitable, and that's the tricky bit, to be honest, that we often help organisations with. The other tricky bit is that we're finding is a bit of a barrier to Azure at the moment for a lot of organisations is their internet connections. So obviously Azure being an online system, you do require the internet to be able to access it. So we have a lot of clients or a lot of organisations come to us that are still on ADSL connections. So if you're listening to this and you're got a pretty bad ADSL connection and you're wanting to have a cloud server, I do hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's not a solution that typically we'd recommend to just try and run a file server or something like that in Azure on a poor ADSL connection. Essentially, it just won't work and you'll be frustrated. So you've obviously got two options there. You can upgrade your internet connection or find a more local storage. So we have some clients in regional Australia where we've deliberately said, look, until the fibre gets put out outside of your office and NBN rolls out and everything's you've got good access to cheap internet, you're just going to have to put up with the server and maybe use Azure or cloud for backups or some other things that aren't as crucial from a performance perspective, but that's another key thing to think about. So really it's the small organizations with ADSL. And to be honest, you can get away with things like email in Office 365 or cloud-hosted, MyOb or Salesforce. You might be able to get away with that and not need a server at all. So that's the other consideration. The other one that we're seeing is a lot of organisations with, say, 30 staff, 20 in the main office, and a couple maybe out and about, 10 staff out and about. Most of those type of organisations are moving towards a synchronous connection, which means that you get the same upload speed as download speed. So in this case, something like a 20 megabit per second upload and download usually is suitable for this type of sort of medium-sized organisation. Now, we would still typically recommend email in Office 365 and maybe a SharePoint intranet and cloud-hosted client management. But in this case, similar to the case study that Joey did earlier, you may still have an Azure server for a domain controller and file archive, and you may still have a VPN and managing things like group policy and central user administration. So look, it is hard to predict exactly what you'll need. It obviously depends on how much data you're pushing and pulling across the connection, how big your files are, how many files you have, whether you're doing video conferencing or whether your staff are downloading Game of Thrones. So it really just does depend on the amount. So it's worth partnering with a network provider that has some flexibility often helps. Now the other thing that we're doing a lot of design work for and helping larger organizations with over 100 staff. Now there's whether you're delivering disability services or childcare services from multiple locations, that's where having a central server often doesn't make as much sense. So this is where organizations are seeing Azure as a good option to essentially have a central server environment in Azure, and then looking at providing access to that from all these different locations. So it might be that you still use email in Office 365 and maybe an intranet and SharePoint, but you have a centrally hosted client management system, or a central VoIP system, and connections through with a central domain controller. And obviously you would need site-to-site VPNs at each one and good routers. So often these organizations do need to upgrade their routers. Obviously VoIP you need to be a bit more careful with, because the voice component, the performance can get a bit flaky if it's not a really good connection. So I suppose we just wanted to give 3 different scenarios of examples of internet connections, and the red, green, yellow of when we think they're suitable for Azure based on internet and when we think they're not. All right, so now that you've had a bit of an overview of what Azure is now, the confusing bit is that it will change very regularly. Even our guys, engineers, struggle to keep up with Microsoft, to be honest, and their roadmap. So they're changing things every day, adding new features and functions and capacity every day. So particularly for those that are a bit techy and interested in next steps, feel free to log on to the roadmap here. I've got the link there to be able to just see what's coming and see what's available. But look, it is a platform that you would invest in and be confident that there's going to be continued growth and changes. Microsoft is investing pretty heavily in this. So I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I want to leave some time for questions. So really the key things I wanted to make sure that you had got from today. Before moving to Azure, just make sure, does the system have a hosted option? So yeah, there's no point paying for a Azure server for $300 a month if Moab Online can host it for you for $30 a month or whatever it may be, or you can get Office 365 for free. So really it's about having a look at asking your vendors and application hosts that question before you try and store it in Azure. And then also, if you do need to store it on a server, are they compatible with Azure? So there are some applications or some scenarios where the vendor will actually say, no, it doesn't work on Azure or on that type of server. You need it on an on-prem server with this old version of Windows or something like that. So that's always an important question. And the other thing that we're finding is catching a lot of organizations out is there is a list of routers that are compatible with Azure, and it's not everything. We find a lot of not-for-profits, their routers aren't compatible with Azure. So part of the process is you would need to upgrade your router, and in many cases is the next point there is you need to upgrade your internet connection. So often some organizations come to us and say, okay, I'm paying $50 a month now for my ADSL, but to upgrade to fiber is going to be $1,000 a month. Should I move? So really that's a mass return on investment sort of question that you all need to ask yourself before you move to Azure. and double check with Connecting Up or TechSoup whether you're eligible for that credit as well. But if you're eligible for other Microsoft products, Office 365 and Office, you're typically eligible for the Azure as well. And really it's about doing the maths around making sure you're aware of all of those costs in Azure, including the VPN, and how that compares with buying a server where you buy it once and depreciate it over 3 or 4 years. So I think that's really the key. You know, a lot of not-for-profits are driven by costs. All right, so my final tips here. Really, it's not about Azure, it's about designing a technology solution that's going to work for your organization in the future. So this is always the first step before you even consider whether it's Azure or AWS or Office 365 or whatever it may be, or a server. Really look at what's your future business model. Are you going to grow? Are you going to shrink? What are your requirements and what systems do you need? How do your staff work? And once you know that, then you can plan the transition, and you don't have to do it all at once. Now, the case study we did before did it all at once, but many are just dipping their toe in the water with backups or just a domain controller and gradually changing. And in most cases, we're actually recommending a hybrid model where you have some local and some in cloud as well. So that's where it is important to get some expert advice. So hopefully you've all got either a staff member or a board member or a provider that has a bit of expertise. It is a new area, so there's a lot of support providers out there that don't have expertise in Azure yet. So I would encourage you to at least sort of get some advice. So they're my tips for today. And I'm hoping we've got some time for questions. Joey and I are happy to stay around as well, even if we go after 3. So I'll throw to you, Ollie, for any questions, and thank you. And I will put my details up there, so my email address, my phone number are all there. So feel free to contact me if there's any questions. Feel free to email them or give me a call, and either Joey or I will get back to you in terms of helping you answer those. So, Ollie, any questions?
Thank you, Matt and Joey. Very comprehensive presentation, obviously, because we don't have any questions at the moment. So if you've got any question, please type them in the question box on your webinar panel. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to write them if you've got any.
Yeah, happy to wait and hang around, but as I said, it might be easier to email those through if you're not sure now. So
we've got a question from Andrew that just popped up. He asked, how can a router be Azure compatible? Is this to do with Azure VPN?
Yes, is the short answer.
Right, so I can field that one. When you buy a VPN, a site-designed VPN, Microsoft include that in their SLA, so that will guarantee that it works. And in order to do that, they need to guarantee that the device at the client end works. So the method that they've chosen to do that is to actually work with certain vendors and certify their routers and also send through a sample config. So commonly, it's not a simple judgment case of whether some routers are better than others. It is simply that the ones that are on the list, and I believe there is a web link which we can send around of routers that Microsoft have certified that will work. And when they do certify them, they also give sample configuration files. So for a Cisco router, for example, that's actually an iOS extract that is provided when you set that up to help you set that up.
Thank you, Joey. We've got a question from Joe. I'm hoping you'll be able to answer that one. If you get infected by CryptoLocker, will the backup stop that on Azure?
Short answer is no. If you're hosting a file server in Azure, then what Azure provides you is a file server. So you would still need to go through your the antivirus and sort of protection as if the server was sitting in your office. Where Azure can help is by providing off-site storage for your backup solutions. Then that might allow you to keep a copy off-site under lock and key, so that if you do get attacked with CryptoLocker, you're able to retrieve a document that nobody else is able to access because it's been stored securely off-site. But fundamentally, with any servers that you host in Azure, you are still responsible for the security of them, and Microsoft basically provides you with the operating system and the drives and the Windows licensing and CALs for that.
Thank you, Joey. That was the last question. So is there anything one of you would like to add before we close this webinar?
Just thanks everyone, and good luck. It is a new frontier in terms of all these great tools and systems available for not-for-profits, but I know it can be daunting as well. So I think the tip is just learn as much as you can, tap into people like Joey and others out there who use these things every day and can give you those tips and tricks. And most importantly, just understand what you're trying to achieve before you start going off and buying things and implementing things. So and exploring what other options are out there. So feel free to get in touch. But yeah, thanks for all your time.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Matt,
everybody.
and thank you, Joey, for presenting. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Just to remind you before I close this webinar, the recording of the session and the slides will be uploaded shortly, and the link will be sent to you. If you have any questions that come to your mind later on or any feedback, please send that through to me at events@connectingup.org, or you can contact Matt using the email address on your screen, and we'll answer those questions offline. Again, thank you for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your day. See you next time.
Thank you.